Most people have a fairly poor understanding of history, and a lot of people also have a very poor understanding of economics. That's why you are going to want to pick up this book, Ages of American Capitalism by Jonathan Levy, because it is going to help you both learn history and economics. But I do feel like this book should come with a warning. Not for people who are reading it, but for people who might go down into the comments. Because this is a book looking at economic history from a Keynesian perspective. And I already know what those comments are gonna look like. All right, I need a book to review for this month. This one is on American economic history. That should have some broad appeal. Huh, interesting. This says it's on a Keynesian perspective of American economic history. Keynesian economics is a joke. Their ideas don't help the economy, they ruin it. Who are you? I'm from the comments. You said Keynes, so I had to come in and tell you why you were wrong. But I didn't even say what part of Keynes he was talking about. Doesn't matter, I stopped watching the video, but I'm gonna go finish writing my comment. Don't subscribe! So what do I mean when I say that this is a Keynesian perspective on economic history? Well, a lot of people, when they think of Keynesian economics, they think of the implications of Keynesian economics. That means when you look at the models, the implications are that the government can help alleviate business cycles by intervening, whether that's spending or taxing. There's a big role for the government in Keynesian economics. But that's not what I mean by a Keynesian perspective on economic history, because that perspective is just on the implications. As I keep saying, we need to get into the assumptions and what assumptions lead to that Keynesian perspective. Well, the assumptions of a Keynesian model is that business cycles are driven by changes in aggregate demand. That is, sometimes people want to spend more and sometimes people want to spend less. And what drives those changes in aggregate demand? Well, Keynes is most famous for saying it was animal spirits, but today we would say it's the psychology. Whether people are confident about the future or whether they are uncertain. When they are confident, they spend. When they're uncertain, they want to pull back. And so Levy looks at history as this competition or a tension between what he calls the gambler and the hoarder. The gambler is the confident one, the one who's making bets on the future, and the hoarder is the one that's afraid of what's coming. They bring their money out of the system and they keep it with them. And that's what makes it so interesting as he's going through and making his arguments. And he's saying, hey, here are times and here are the conditions that lead to people being more confident and making their gambles. And here are the times when they start to fade and they want to hoard. And it's really interesting to look at economic history in that perspective. And the question is, how correct is he? Like, is he looking at history the right way? I'll get to that in just a minute, but I want to just share with you some of the things that really stood out to me about this book. The one that made me say, like, this is definitely something that I could recommend. First is related to my teaching. So I teach American economic history. I've been teaching it for the past 5 years, and I had to design my syllabus from scratch. There really aren't great undergraduate level textbooks in economic history. And so I pulled together 25 topics that I thought were going to be interesting, from European contact all the way up to the Great Recession. And I was trying to figure out what are the details that my students need to know. Now, as I'm reading this, after 5 years of teaching, it is a little creepy how closely this book matches with the things I teach. Like, some of the quotes I use in class were being put in this book as well. And in fact, I found myself just all the time marking pages that had interesting details that I could bring into my class and really show them, like, hey, here's the numbers behind this, or here's another story that I didn't realize was out there. And so it might be a little selfish here, but one of the reasons why this book stood out to me was how closely it already matched what I was thinking about in American economic history. Like, I would feel confident assigning this book as a textbook for my class. The second reason that I have enjoyed this book deals with Fashion Week. Every year we get bombarded by pictures of people going out into Fashion Week or really any other event that involves high fashion. And while I try to avoid those pictures entirely, there's also the critics who get involved talking about the fabrics, the textures, the colors. And it's like they're missing the bigger picture that the clothing is absolutely ridiculous. And first we need to resolve that issue before we start talking about all these other side issues. And that is how I have felt that historians have been treating economic history for the past decade. The biggest issue in economic history by historians lately has been slavery. You see it come up all the time. It's really the center of the new history of capitalism. And you get all these people within the history community debating, how did America get so productive in cotton production? Well, it was through slavery and through the abuses. And yes, those things come in and play a role in how, America became a top cotton producer. But the big thing, this huge thing, the Fashion Week clothes are absolutely ridiculous thing, is that there was huge innovation in cotton production through the seeds. There's some great work in economic history showing that there were these new seeds that were able to produce more cotton, and as a result, the US became incredibly productive at producing cotton. And yes, obviously slavery is interacting with that, and there are things done with the slaves to make it more productive, and it was an abusive, coercive, terrible system. But if you leave out the part about the seeds, you're missing a really big and the arguably most important part of the picture. Well, I was really interested to see what was going to happen in this book since it's written by a historian and it's clearly in this new history of capitalism vein. And as I got to the slavery section, I'm reading the paragraph and he's starting off and he's citing these arguments about the abuses. And then I get to the last few sentences of the paragraph and he says, but really the most conclusive evidence is that it was because of the brand new seed that came through and made things more productive. And that is when I was like, man, this is fantastic. Yes, he's bringing up those arguments, but most importantly, he talks about the big thing there, and that is the innovations that were coming through and how much more important those were than anything else going on. So that really sold me on this book. So, now this brings up the question of whether I think his perspective is correct on Keynesian perspective on economic history. And I'll just say, first off, ultimately, I just don't even think it matters that much, because the important thing is that he's going through history with this economics perspective, and it makes history so much more interesting. I get through economic history and I wonder, why do high school and other college level courses focus on these details that just don't seem as invigorating to me? When I look at the history of war, so many historians, or it feels like so many people consuming history, focus so much on the wars and the conflicts through history, and they just completely ignore the economics. It's just a side picture. But when you go through history with the economics perspective, oh man, it just things click. It makes sense why that's what happened in history. And you just get to see such an interesting and important facet of history, because it's that economics part that really comes in and helps us later on. Today, the lessons that we learn from the economic history, we can still apply those super well, right? When we talk about the Panic of 1907, and bank runs that were happening then and through the Great Depression, that matters when we talk about bank runs happening today. Those are the lessons that really stick. And so I think the most important part is not necessarily the perspective, but the fact that he's actually highlighting those events in history that are related to economics. And then once you take his perspective, it's really easy for you to go find someone else talking about these things, and you can start learning more about those. Now, overall, I think the perspective was pretty fine. I didn't have any strong aversions to it, right? In fact, the times where I thought I was going to come in and disagree with him heavily, he usually came in and said nope, I agree with the economists on this. So overall, I think like it's a pretty good treatment of history, and I highly recommend it to people who are getting into economic history because, man, the great part about this is you've been learning history your entire education. Ever since you go to kindergarten, you start learning about history, but it's hard for you to get economics. So it's fantastic to see taking this thing that's so familiar. Let's take history, that thing that you've been learning about for so long, and let's use it to introduce those topics that are hard, that are new. Let's learn about economics by treating history first. And so if that's you, great place to start. Highly recommend this. And once you learn that, that's not the only thing you need to know to understand economics. Like, there are so many places where you can just have your worldview completely challenged. That's why I've put together this playlist of books that will get you so excited about learning economics in the real world.